Hi, this is a presentation on the Citarum River to the Indonesian Forum for the Environment. This is going to talk about the geography, the history of the region, the three E's, equity, economics, and environment. And then we're going to actually get into some of the info on the textile industry, what is the problem and who is it affecting, and what has been done to fix it, and why hasn't it worked. So let's start with the geography and history of the region. The Citarum River Basin lies in the northwestern part of the island of Java, southeast of the Indonesian capital, Jakarta. As you can see on this map, zooming out from the world to Southeast Asia to the upper Citarum River Basin, this is a big thing. It's a reasonably large watershed. It's located in the volcanic highlands of northwestern Indonesia. The Citarum River's headwaters start on the slope of the twin volcano Wayang Windu. The basin starts as high as 2,750 meters above sea level and has an area of approximately 6,000 square kilometers. So the Citarum was also the seat of the Tarumanagara kingdom, dating back to the 4th century BCE. The river and the ancient kingdom share the name of an indigenous indigo plant, Tarum. It is possible the region has been involved in textile processing for over a millennium. During the colonization period, the Dutch built a town there. And it was good for agriculture and tea plantations and whatnot. It was also much cooler than the actual city of Jakarta. The town became popular amongst the Dutch due to its scenic beauty and, again, its significantly cooler temperatures. But the Dutch colonists, who had clearly never visited a French urban or cultural center, called the Paris of Java. It's not Paris of Java. So, actually, one second. When Indonesia achieved its independence in 1945, the papers were actually signed in a house on the banks of the Citarum. So this is clearly a very important historical and cultural place for the civilization of Indonesia. So let's talk about the three E's: environment, equity, and economics. I'm going to start with economics, move into equity, and finish with environment in this little introduction. But for the economic aspect, we're going to be looking at the textile industry, the fishing and agriculture that is dependent on the Citarum, and the power that is generated in its multiple hydroelectric plants. This actually is a picture of the inside of one of the textile plants along the Citarum River. So the textile industry, there is supposedly about 2,000 industrial polluters along Citarum and its canals. This isn't necessarily 100% accurate because about 1,800 of these are very small, local, kind of in-house, like inside of houses, industrial polluters. So it is like local businesses. 200 of these, however, are textile mills. The three of these companies have been particularly egregious and have been cited by the government for really just trashing the river. And those are PT Kahatex, PT Insan Senda Internusia, and PT 5-Star Textile. We're also going to talk about PT Gistex later, but that's part of Sara's presentation. The waters of the Citarum are also used for irrigation. The waters of the actual watershed and what is held in the three reservoirs are used to irrigate rice fields. However, this rice is considered unfit for human consumption and is actually fed to cattle. There are three major dams on the Citarum River. Two of them are actually producing electricity. They're actually hydroelectric dams, and they produce about 300 megawatts worth of energy. This is a significant amount of Indonesia's just electrical use. About 2.5 million people rely on the Citarum for drinking water. This is bad. The Citarum is not a very viable source for potable water. There's also hardly any fish left. The fishermen who used to fish there actually use their nets now to pull out salvage and recyclables. So they become more garbage men than fishermen. So let's talk about equity. Who has benefited and who has been harmed? So who has benefited? Well, the answer to that is really us, first world consumers of textiles. If you like the Gap, you have benefited from the destruction and damage to the Citarum River Basin. The industrialists here have actually benefited from an apparent utter lack of enforcement, regulation, or basic safety oversight. They've been allowed to really just dump their stuff into the ocean, or not the ocean, into the Citarum rivershed. There is some data that implies another benefiting group are the corrupt Indonesian politics and officials. That's a little hard to find because just in general, Indonesia is considered one of the most corrupt countries in, at the very least, Southeast Asia. So who has suffered? Well, the 2.5 million Indonesians that actually directly get their water from, their drinking water from the rivershed, and about 28 million people who rely on the river and its watershed in general. Actually, about 60,000 people were displaced, so just speaking back to our current segment in the water resource class. 60,000 locals have actually been displaced by the Sagalong Dam alone. So the smell during the dry season is so toxic that it makes people faint. During the dry season, the water is there's significantly less power to move the water along, so it sits and just festers. And honestly, we've all suffered because if you count the environment as a common pool resource, it has been degraded. This has unequivocally been degraded, as you can see in this picture. So finally, let's talk about the environment. Well, finally in this introduction, we're going to continue on. It's hard to see in this picture, but the foam, this water, is actually very foamy and is actually pink coming over this terrace. This water is pink. So what's in it? Well, there's toxins. There's toxic chemicals such as metals. These include copper and lead. There's a significant amount of copper and lead, and some organochloride pesticides. There's also high concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus, which are causing the eutrophication of the rivershed, which is, again, killing the fish due to the lack of oxygen. And finally, the garbage and trash. Some places, there's so much trash in the Citarum River that you can't see the water. This is just physical, just things, plastic, just industrial waste on the surface. About 20,000 tons of waste and about 340,000 tons of wastewater are disposed directly into the river daily. So like I said before, now we're going to move into some of the aspects of the textile industry. We're also going to talk about what the problem is and who it's affecting, and what has been done to fix it and why it hasn't worked.
The idea that the Citarum River is nasty is a globally acknowledged fact. Due to the impoverished state of Indonesia, government officials do not place improved water infrastructure very high on their list of humanitarian priorities. Like many other nations, rural Indonesian inhabitants practice open defecation. The human effluent has led to the Citarum water contamination by coliform bacteria, as reported by the Asian Development Bank, to be present at 5,000 times greater than the allowable level. The health effect of a bacteria like this includes dysentery, typhoid fever, viral and bacterial gastroenteritis, and even hepatitis A. Fabric production imports to the United States and Europe are exported from rural areas of Indonesia. The economic impact of this industry is substantial, with major clothing corporations such as Gap, Adidas, and H&M relying on fabric production from these types of facilities. The Supreme Audit Agency reported over 70 textile companies contributing to pollution in the Citarum River Basin. The most infamous contributor to the chemical dumping into the freshwater is PT Gistex, a Greige fabric producer established along the Citarum River in 1975 that outputs fabric products 24/7. Fabric production is more than just spinning yarn. With the advent of polyester and polyvinyl clothing contemporarily replacing cotton, chemical treatments are necessary to incorporate plastics into soft, breathable fabrics. The Green Cross Switzerland found devastating chemical effluent from PT Gistex in Citarum waters. These toxins have catastrophic human health impacts, with the water being consumed and used for irrigation. 2 chemicals with different uses but similar effects were discovered by the Green Cross. A heat stabilizer to protect PVC fabric from heat or fading is called nonylphenol and is a solvent and grinding assistant. Two chemicals with different uses but similar effects were discovered by the Green Cross. A heat stabilizer to protect PVC fabrics from heat or fading is called nonylphenol, and a solvent and grinding assistant called nonylphenol ethoxylate. Human exposure to nonylphenols promotes inflammation in the gastrointestinal tract. It has estrogen-like properties, which alters gene expression and also acts as an endocrine disruptor. This can lead to reproductive issues, which include birth defects as well as deformity development. Symptoms of exposure include a burning sensation, cough, labored breathing, sore throat, fainting, skin irritation, and burns. A plasticizer known as tributyl phosphate was also present in the Green Cross samples. Inhaling vapors formed from the chemical reaction with water of tributyl phosphate causes irritation of mucous membranes, and there can be a general poisoning with paralysis. It may cause irritation of the eyes, nose, and throat, and may also cause nausea and headache, which don't seem that bad compared to paralysis. But still, it's unfortunate that Indonesians are suffering from these terrible toxic effects. The Indonesians suffering from water insecurity are infamous for their growing population maladies. A terribly sad and notorious instance of estrogen exposure and endocrine disruption is the root-like tumors that have developed on people's extremities called epidermoplasia. 3, 2, 1. Indonesians suffering from water insecurity are infamous for their growing population maladies. A terribly sad and notorious instance of estrogen exposure and endocrine disruption is the root-like tumors that have developed on people's extremities. The scientific name for this is epidermoplasia verruciformis, but it's better known to the rest of us as tree man syndrome. After development, the disease becomes hereditary. In 2013, better known as tree man syndrome. After development, the disease becomes hereditary. This is the most infamous case of tree man syndrome. This man was the first to be publicly acknowledged for his deformity, but it's actually developed in many other instances. People may not develop this deformity directly from interaction with Citarum waters, and it is not people may not develop this deformity from contact with Citarum waters, but due to the chemical toxicity that is known for endocrine disruption and deformation, it's not a cause that is completely ruled out. In 2013, the Indonesian High Court, ruling in a lawsuit brought by Greenpeace Indonesia and community organization, ruled to suspend, cancel, and revoke government decrees to allow illegal dumping for many infamous fabric producers. Unfortunately, PT Gistex was not one of the corporations.
The Citarum River and its tributaries have incredible implications for the economic and social circumstances surrounding in the surrounding watershed. For this reason, it is important to know the history of Indonesian economics and how this has influenced society today. During the 1950s, the manufacturing industries flocked to Indonesia, creating a massive employment boom, especially in Java. Economic growth was actually kind of slow, but the government had a lot more income to invest in infrastructure. Unfortunately, there was a great resistance to this investment and structural change that was shown in a prosperity gap between agricultural and manufacturing industries. A similar gap was shown between groups in the agricultural sector, as government incentives and subsidies were given to those who produced rice crops, and none or even less were given to those who did not. Therefore, people who were not producing rice crops were the ones that were the most negatively affected by these changes in pollution, by this change in the economy, because they were given the least amount of economic support in times of need. The Indonesian government also favors investment in industries where they have a natural and comparative advantage, and this is really shown in economic or energy sectors. And capital-intensive mining and logging operations were really mainly established, causing great degradation to the economy and the environment. Unfortunately, these industries only really provided a low-income opportunity, which didn't really contribute to these rural areas where they were being established, again, increasing this divide between the rural and urban areas. In the 1960s, the government began focusing on economic development and stabilization between these sectors, which was mildly successful in all of these industries. This was bolstered greatly by the increase in petroleum exports. In the 1980s, the price of oil greatly fell, and the country had to begin deregulating the economy. This in turn led to privatization and an increase in growth of a lot of manufacturing industries, such as textiles, footwear, apparel, and consumer electronics. When the economy recovered, the more money was funneled into these agricultural industries, and it can be argued that this increased the wages of these rural workers. But again, this only really benefited those that produced these rice crops and did not benefit those that did not. In more recent times, in the 21st century, the total workforce of the Citarum watershed has only increased as the population and migrations patterns grow. This increase has outpaced job growth and therefore has led to a decline in job opportunities and higher unemployment, which again is seen in this struggle that the agricultural workers are seeing at the moment. For this reason, the Citarum watershed and the river plays an impactful role in the economic development of this watershed through services such as agriculture, hydroelectric power, public water supply, industrial water use, factories, and recreation. More than 50% of the basin is used for agricultural products. As the river is becoming more polluted, unfortunately, many of these resident agricultural producers have been forced to abandon their practices, such as rice paddy farms and fisheries. This in turn increases income inequality and unemployment in the areas, as those who use the river as their water supply for livelihood are falling deeper and deeper into poverty, as those in the manufacturing industries are only profiting off of this pollution of this river. In order to make a semblance of a living, as we have discussed, the citizens who have nets, who were participating in fisheries, actually are collecting pieces of garbage and recycling to sell them for several cents on the dollar, which is not enough of a living to get by. The farmers that have been fortunate enough to continue their operations have now often had to find opportunities off of the farm in order to supplement their income for their primary field of employment. Again, they have to find 2-3 more jobs to supplement their living wage, which they are not getting through agriculture. While the growth in Indonesia seems to benefit everyone, it is obvious that the income has not been distributed evenly between rural and urban areas. The river and its tributaries, as we said, is a source of water for millions of people and 269 wildlife species, and it supplies 80% of water to the Indonesian capital. Without a clean water supply for its people and its farms, the watershed could be in great danger, and without a plan of action for improving water quality, the environmental degradation of the area could only worsen and the economic divide only increase. Unfortunately, as it will be discussed, policy that has been passed has only led to further economic suffering. For example, when water was privatized to address these pollution problems, those who suffered the most were, unfortunately, these people who were in poverty-stricken areas who could not afford the now higher price of water, but were forced to pay it as it is an important part of their daily health, their daily industry such as agriculture, and their daily way of life. Those who would benefit tended to be far wealthier again, causing a great income inequality. Obviously, it is really important that we find a plan of action to address these changes in the future. Otherwise, this problem is only going to get worse, and this divide, again, is only going to increase.
So what has been done to clean up the Citarum River? First, the Citarum Watershed Management and Biodiversity Conservation Project, initiated and funded by the Global Environment Facility, cost a little over $30 billion to complete, and the project was completed in 2016. We consider it to be somewhat of a failure since the Citarum River is still considered one of the most polluted rivers in the world. President Widodo of Indonesia created a military task force in 2018 as an aggressive strategy to clean up the Citarum River. Since the military doesn't have to deal with government red tape and can quickly target major polluters and has enough numbers to implement large-scale projects like planting trees in 2,500 hectares near the river's headwaters to mitigate erosion. However, the Indonesian Forum for the Environment has accused the president of using this program for political gain, since industry still lacks proper regulations to make this strategy make any headway in long-term cleanup effort, which is one reason why these efforts haven't worked so far. They are considered short-term fixes. Additionally, locals have yet to be included in cleanup efforts, and critics argue that without that component, the strategy lacks longevity. The river also currently spans multiple administrative districts, which makes coordination and regulation overly complicated. And finally, once the river is cleaned up, the area lacks the proper infrastructure to manage waste. While the president of Indonesia has been instrumental in initiating cleanup efforts, it's not enough. Our plan is to join forces with the Indonesian Forum for the Environment, which collaborates with over 400 other non-governmental organizations and has the power to lobby the Indonesian government for cleanup reform. We want to enlist locals to help in cleanup efforts, and we want to develop education initiatives to ensure the longevity of proper waste disposal. We also want to create water management districts with a centralized government body to streamline any administrative complications that may exist now. And we also want to close some of the textile factories that are contributing to the major pollution of the river and open waste management facilities in their place to replace those lost jobs and create infrastructure. We invite you to consider our proposal and do what's best for Indonesia's natural areas.